I want to welcome everyone who is Zooming in for what promises to be a really enlightening and stimulating session on museums and empathy. Uh, in these times when the shock of the pandemic closed the vast majority of museums for such a long period of time, and only cautiously have museums begun to reopen, with many limitations on all the former ways that we took for granted in using them. But it's made for, albeit a grim but insistent prompting, to assess what museums have become, what they're for, and what experiences they make possible. Much of this questioning is being insisted upon by younger museum professionals whose livelihoods and prospects have been most put at risk. But this precarity has not made them more conservative, but on the whole more outspoken and more desirous of some fundamental reassessments and changes. The presumed authority of the objects that predominate in many collections was already being thrown open to question, such that the inevitably unrepresentative character of virtually any collection will no longer serve as an adequate justification for the visitor's experience. And our panelists this afternoon are contributing to an emerging movement within museum practice that no longer wants to leave the affective responses of all the participants in the museum environment to chance. The operative word is empathy, whether through encounters with the individual object and its depth of historical existence, or through intensely shared experiences that museums offer, or through the new ways museums are able to assemble diverse communities in a shared space, one that one of our speakers, Dr. Keltner, calls a temple of empathy. Our first contributor, Elif Gochidem, is a scholar of Islamic art, and she will offer an expansive view of empathy as a tool that has the power of unlocking human potential to realize interconnectedness to all things in existence, and why this realization, or what she calls a oneness mindset, is essential in solving some of the most complex problems our humanity is facing at the time. And she has a special interest in how museums can design themselves intentionally for empathy, so it's not taken for granted as a byproduct of an undirected learning experience. Dr. Keltner, speaking from UC Berkeley, will expand upon his idea of the museum as a temple of empathy, taking us inside his role in creating the Center for Empathy and Visual Arts in collaboration with the Minneapolis Institute of Art. His is the perspective of an academic psychologist concerned with what happens when we experience wonder in the face of extraordinary works of art, thereby leaving the confines of the armored self behind and becoming open to identification with the feelings of others. Helen Chatterjee from University College London will take us through the ways that she is discovering cultural and creative participation, having remarkable impacts on physical and mental health. Here, she has a special interest in older persons who endure forms of isolation and impairment, for whom the museum and arresting works of art can perform a healing and restorative function. Maral Bedouyan, manager of museum education at the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, will likewise address the manifold contributions of the arts to health and well-being. And our last speaker, Kavita Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she is Dean of the School of Arts and Aesthetics, will conclude by addressing the situation of Indian tribal art in museums at a time when tribal, that is, indigenous people in the subcontinent, are under tremendous stress. Then we will have a 15 minutes or so of discussion amongst the panelists, and then turn things over to questions that you are all invited to post in the Q&A, which I will then convey to the speakers. So with no more delay, I would like to turn things over to Elif Ghoshadem. Please. Elif, you need to
unmute myself.
Oh, yes.
Well, thank you, Tom, again for the introduction, and thanks to our hosts and all the coordinators for creating this space for us for this conversation. Within the next 10 minutes, I will try to very quickly provide you with a quick overview of empathy within the context of Empathy Building Through Museums initiative, followed by some learnings from our projects and some suggestions for how might we collectively implement and move these ideas forward. May I request the next slide by any chance? It is not. Let me see. Okay. Empathy's most common description is our ability to feel like another. When we take another's perspective and imagine that could be me, we put ourselves in another's shoes, which inspires us to take action to alleviate that problem as if it is our own. Empathy within the context of our interdependence is essential for the development of caring mindsets, compassionate worldviews, and wise decision-making that enable our collective survival. Good news is that research tells us that empathy can be learned and can be practiced to improve it. Similar to going to a gym to build our muscles, we need to create those spaces and experiences that allow us to build our empathy. Because this is supposed to be a case study, I thought just a quick snapshot of the empathy building through museums would be useful. I have been researching and exploring empathy as part of my initiative since 2013. This exploration, which began as a very personal journey in 2006, turned into a book project in 2014 and quickly evolved in an international collaborative, which resulted in the publishing of 2 books, Fostering Empathy Through Museums and Designing for Empathy, Perspectives on the Museum Experience, which came out in 2019 from the AAM Publishing, American Alliance of Museums. The initiative also curated 3 international Designing for Empathy summits, which collectively brought together hundreds of multidisciplinary, diverse thinkers, institutions, leaders, and experts from around the globe to actively create solutions to the empathy deficit in our world. Our first Empathy Summit took us to Dharamsala in India in 2018 at the invitation of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Only last month, in October 2020, we've concluded the 3rd annual Designing for Empathy Summit, which of course was a virtual event and is now available online for viewing. Currently, the initiative is in the process of evolving into a nonprofit organization called ONE, Organization of Networks for Empathy. This organization will allow us to partner with a diverse group of institutions to advance empathy building around the world. One of my explorations of empathy brought me to Louvre Abu Dhabi Museum a couple of years ago. Those who have visited might have also noticed the quote attributed to Rumi at the very entrance of the building, which greets every visitor. It reads, "Everything in the universe is within you." I believe this quote is essential to our discussion here today and to our understanding of the potential of empathy for our humanity, our environment, and our planet. Rumi's quote represents a particular way of seeing the universe and our place within. It sees everything in existence as a manifestation of a single life source. This worldview acknowledges and appreciates the oneness of all beings. Here, a human being is not a standalone individual, independent or disengaged from others that surround him, but on the contrary, is a unique and essential part of something much greater than himself. A being that has the capacity to harbor all the qualities of the universe within the shape of a human form. In a way, all the diversity in the universe within him and around him are an invitation for him to find his way back to the source. Because how we live it is how we see it is how we live it. As human beings, our ability to perceive our interdependence or oneness has tremendous practical implications in shaping our attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors towards what we consider as the other. Empathy enables us to connect with ourselves with others while awakening us into our interconnectedness as parts of a greater whole, all of humanity and the planet. An awareness of our interconnectedness then calibrates and harmonizes our values, attitudes, and behavior. An appreciation for this interdependent whole, or one, inspires us to meaningfully engage with it through acts of compassion and altruism that recent scientific findings reveal that are like chocolate to us. The more we experience them, the more we want to experience them. So not only we are wired to connect, but also to find ways to serve the greater good. As empathy can only be learned through lived experiences, creating those experiences where individuals can discover, unlock, and advance their potential for empathy in safe and non-judgmental spaces become more essential. This is where museums come into play. Fostering empathy through museums includes 15 contributed chapters by experts representing a variety of museums, from arts museums to children to science to civil rights centers, and even an animal sanctuary. Collectively, they outline the three ways how museums have been thinking about empathy: as an institutional core value, as a tool for educational and design, or as a phenomenon and an intentional outcome of a museum experience. Another lesson learned from this book was that despite the diversity of their missions and approaches to empathy, all of these museums possess a common strength in 5 specific ways they are able to contribute to empathy building in our world. By becoming safe spaces for encountering the other and creating those opportunities for dialogue through storytelling, by creating experiential learning opportunities, by offering experiences that evoke a sense of awe and wonder, by providing safe spaces for contemplation. As I moved through my explorations of empathy, I wanted to know, for example, what is in storytelling that makes it such a transformative empathetic experience? What are some of the other ingredients that are at play? If we know better and better understand these ingredients, can we intentionally design for them so that empathy is not a byproduct of an experience, but an intentional outcome? These explorations were at the heart of my second book, Designing for Empathy. Here I have invited 25 contributing authors, which included museum and non-museum experts, and I posed them with the following 3 questions. The first question was, who and what is the object or the other of your empathy? How do we perceive the other when we look through the eyes of the heart, the brain, conscious experience, the worldview, or augmented reality? The second question was, what are the ingredients of the alchemy of empathy? What are some of the ingredients of transformative perspective change? And what can we learn about these qualities so that we might intentionally utilize them in our designing for empathy? So the alchemy of empathy ingredients include intentionality, intersectionality, curiosity, play, vulnerability, awe and wonder, contemplation and nuance, storytelling, synchronicity, collective journeying, breaking bread, optimism, and hope. These ingredients do not have sharp edges or corners. They are somewhat fluid, like drops of water. They are sort of like interbeings, that they exist within each other. For example, breaking bread is one of the ingredients of the alchemy of empathy. However, when you look closer, it is not alone. It requires other ingredients to support it, such as the brave spaces where this dialogue can take place, or the courage of the people who show up for the challenge. The last question for the framework was, what are the scope and the spectrum of empathy? To what end we are trying to foster empathy? What is our ultimate goal with all this work? What is the role of empathy in shaping our ethics and values, how we interact with our planet and the environment, what we expect from education and entrepreneurship, how can we advance innovation and design and societal progress? To conclude, I would like to summarize my learnings in the following 5 perspectives that might be useful when considering empathy building or designing for empathy in our institutions. Prepare for a long journey. Empathy building is not governed by an on-off switch. It is a journey that awaits our participation individually, institutionally, and culturally. Museums hold the key ingredients of empathy building, perhaps more than any other institution that our civilization has ever created. All kinds of museums are uniquely equipped to serve as platforms that foster empathy as a life skill through experiential learning, dialogue, authentic experiences of awe and wonder, and contemplation. Within the context of our interdependence and the problems that our planet is facing, museums have a responsibility to invest in empathy building. Empathy as an outcome is also the beginning. When institutions decide to explore empathy building, they quickly realize that to become spaces that foster empathy, first they have to look at themselves in the mirror and assess their legacies, policies, and practices to see what steps they need to take to become good, authentic role models. This, of course, becomes a process that quickly also includes the individuals and the leadership that make up these organizations. Establish standards and best practices. Just like before embarking on a collective journey, it is essential to agree upon the shared values, terminologies, standards, and best practices to be used along the way. The answers of these 2 questions mentioned earlier can help guide us finding the right partners and tools. How do we identify with and perceive the other? Who and what is the object of our empathy? And what are the ingredients and the scope and the spectrum of empathy building? The fourth perspective would be the exploring the alchemy of empathy. Well, we intuitively know that some things have the power to bring us closer, such as storytelling, collective journeying, music, dance, humor, and play. What are some other design elements of empathy that can cause a perspective-shifting transformational experience? How can we learn more about these ingredients and discover new ones from experts from all walks of life? Here, considering unifying narratives is also very important. Museums hold a mirror through which we can observe and learn from our past relationship with each other and the environment, create new narratives, and imagine the future. Highlighting and creating those experiences where individuals can experience their connectedness to all of humanity and the environment is something that museums can do intentionally. Finally, position empathy as a cross-sectors shared value. Human behavior and empathy lie at the heart of most solutions to our global economic, societal, or environmental problems, and that museums are uniquely equipped but underutilized platforms that foster empathy. As empathy is an essential future workforce skill with economic, industrial, societal, and environmental implications, it should be further explored as a shared value field for industries and communities to invest in it collectively. Investments in empathy and practices in empathy building should ultimately become one of the indicators of an organization's success. I have tried to share some of our findings here in a nutshell. Empathy can unlock our human potential and lead to compassion, altruism, unity, and love. We have a long way to go, but potential of empathy, I think, is worth for us to give it our best try. Thank you again for your invitation to participate in the conversation and allowing me to share a few ideas here.
Thank you very much, Elif. That is an excellent overview and foundation, I think, for all the contributions and discussion to come. Now we will hear from Dr. Keltner, who is will be present virtually, even more virtually than the rest of us, and so we turn to him.
Hello, my name is Dacher Keltner. I'm a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley. And very importantly for today, I was raised by two artists and grew up in museums, which I can honestly say changed my life. So today what I'd like to talk to you about is a concept that I've been partnering with and also studying scientifically, which is perhaps translated as museums as empathy temples. They are places where we can cultivate this master strength of human empathy. So what do we mean by empathy? And there's a rich scientific literature that spans hundreds, if not thousands of studies that breaks down empathy in terms of skills, particular regions in the brain that serve those skills. And we think about empathy as really doing a few different things. One, it's where you feel what other people feel, a very important tendency in social life. A second is where you are able to project into other people's minds and understand what they feel. And then a third piece to empathy is where you actually see the world through other people's eyes. It's a very difficult, some people believe impossible task cognitively, but in this particular slice of empathy, it's really taking the perspective upon a context of someone around you or a fictional character or somebody you might encounter on a painting in a museum. This is really captured by the poet Percy Shelley defending poetry, where he said, "The great secret of morals is love, or going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. A person to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively, put him or herself in the place of another and many others." What Shelley is talking about, which is true in thinking about the function of literature and painting and music, is the arts are this great pathway to imagining the world from other people's points of view. Why should we care about this scientifically? Why should we care about this as a culture? Thinking about the function of our institutions. When you think about in the United States, about a quarter of US citizens visit an art museum within the course of a year. That's enormous. Millions of people are going to LA County Museum or Minneapolis Institute of Arts, et cetera. And so it's this opportunity for cultivating this empathy skill. Why should this matter? Well, the rich study of empathy is finding this is one of the most important skills that you can build on and change and refine throughout the course of your life. So these are just some studies finding, for example, if you're an 8-year-old, you get along with your peers better. If you're training your empathy, you get better grades in middle school and high school. Stéphane Coté in Canada has found if you're really good at knowing what other people feel, you rise in the ranks in finance organizations. Studies are finding in the United States and elsewhere that if you're a teacher and you empathize and feel what other students feel, they like you more. If you're a medical doctor and you are able to know where your patient is that day and feeling and thinking, that relationship goes better. Even teams like cricket teams in the United Kingdom and nursing units and basketball teams do better if they're aligning in their emotions. So empathy, Danny Goleman, when he wrote about emotional intelligence, it observed, is one of the most direct pathways to health and well-being. So when we think about going to a museum and we think about moving exhibits and we think about the possibility that a visit to a museum can change an individual's life for the better, one of the pathways that we think is really vibrant is through empathy. I'm just going to give you some examples of how this is so. And this is just from the realm of photography. I've personally been changed by a lot of painters. Photographers provide a lens into parts of the world that many people will not see, like Dorothea Lange on poverty. Or Richard Avedon in his series of photographing drifters in the West. And for many people, you think about somebody who's from an upper class background going to an art museum, encountering these drifters. They don't see these people in their lives, and they get a chance to study this part of human nature. Diane Arbus was famous for capturing the emotion of living in the city, right, in her style of photography. And I just can't help but point out, this photograph here of these two young kids just captures the joy and playfulness and spirit of young kids, as well as almost any kind of encounter that somebody might engage in. I have done a lot of research on social class, and the photography of Jim Goldberg in California and Oakland, where he did this very unusual thing is he would go in to people's homes and photograph the rich and the poor, which was the title of the exhibit series, have them write on the photographs. Those photos of Goldberg's series speak more to the very nature, the truth, the ground truth of poverty and wealth than any scientific study, right? And I love this photograph on the right that says, we're an emotional, tight family. Poverty sucks, but it brings us close together, which is in effect what I found in our research. Art, visual art in museums is a way in which we encounter others. So let me tell you about a partnership that I've been involved in. And it is with the Minneapolis Institute of Arts at the Center for Empathy in the Visual Arts. And the idea here is to orient to thinking about the museum as a place of experimentation, a place of emotional exercise, if you will, a temple where we can orient viewers and visitors to exhibits to capitalize on the power of empathy. There's a really interesting new rich scholarship on how is it that art leads us to empathize through our imaginations, through simulating, through projecting ourselves into other people's lives, through direct experience, where you see a Rothko painting and it feels like depression. Many different pathways are starting to be unpacked. And so with the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, what we are doing is, first of all, we're doing studies of empathy in art, right? To show on a large scale basis for school kids that go to the exhibits, for elderly, maybe these experiences in museums promote empathy, and we'll start to understand how and why. Is it through feelings of beauty? Is it through feelings of awe and wonder? Is it through emotionally disturbing encounters with people who are suffering, right, or who are different from you? So we're doing a really nice science. And then what we've also worked in partnership with the SIVA and the Institute of Arts is to start to design exhibits as empathy journeys. And we've worked through, in large part, guided by the team at the MIA, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And I'd really encourage you to look into this because they've taken great pains, really powerful staff to kind of figure out how do you get a viewer to go through an exhibit and not just look at the notes at the side of the piece of art or kind of classify it, but really engage emotionally. And what I'll sort of focus you on are a few fundamental tools. One is perspective-taking questions, where you engage, for example, 10-year-olds to think about if you're looking at indigenous art from a particular part of the United States, say a basket, how would they make that basket? What would be involved? How would they produce those geometric patterns? What we know, both from science and the humanities, is that narrative and stories are powerful engines of empathy. When we narrate experience, we consult the imagination, we project into other people's lives. And so throughout the exhibit, what we have people do is write about their experiences. What is called up personally? What memories do they have? What issue do they think about socially? And then share in small groups. And I've been part of an exhibit, and it's astounding to see what other viewers are thinking about a piece as compared to your own reaction. And then finally, I would argue there's a contemplative approach to art, that it is really, there are mindfulness exercises where you just calm and orient toward this sacred act of looking at art. And we're really excited to be collecting data pretty soon. We've been held back by COVID, obviously, as a way to get a sense of what does art mean to individuals and how does it promote empathy. So for those of you who are interested in this, we at the Greater Good Science Center have actually been promoting empathy and compassion and awe and wonder in a lot of different ways. We've been doing this in schools and in hospitals, in museums and in zoos, all manner of public institutions where the greater good is truly facilitated. And then if you're interested in the science, including of empathy, consult our online classes or go to ggia.berkeley.edu, which has practices that you can engage in. So if you want to sort of take a viewer through an exhibit and perhaps have them reflect on their compassion, we've got good exercises there. And then I've written a few books. And I, in this partnership, having myself had my life changed by viewing exhibits of the Dutch masters or Jim Goldberg or other kinds of artists, I'm really excited about this partnership, this convergence of science and the humanities in the realm of art, where we have this great opportunity to return to what is really defining of human nature, which is art, and to bring it to as many people as we can. So thanks so much for letting me be part of this conversation.
Well, thank you, Dacher. And no unnecessary delay, I would like to turn from his psychological perspective to that of biology and therapeutic settings, to which Helen Chatterjee will now speak.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Tom, and thanks to everybody for coming on today and for inviting me. Hopefully you can hear me okay and you can see my slides, but let me know if you have any problems. So it's lovely to be here. And as Tom says, I'm going to talk about the sorts of research that we do, which is very much focused on how we can understand and evidence the impact of arts, cultural and nature-based participation on different aspects of health. We're very focused on both the biological and the psychosocial, so what happens in the whole person. And we're very interested in a more person-centered approach. So a lot of our work is very focused on thinking about what sorts of methods or approaches can we use to best understand people's interaction with arts and nature. And I'll talk very briefly as well about how we can translate some of the sorts of findings from research into how we can best make use of our wonderful assets like museums, particularly with a focus on addressing inequalities. So we work with a whole range of different organisations, museums, arts organisations, nature-based organisations, in collaboration with cultural, health, social care and third sector providers. But most importantly, I guess, are the participants that we work with. And our work is very much focused on those audiences that are not typically using those sorts of organisations. So they're not typical museum users. And that might be due to psychological or physical barriers that they might be facing in accessing those sorts of organisations. For example, they might be in hospital, or they might be in healthcare settings, or they might have particular social circumstances which mean that they're not accessing those particular resources. So we work with a wide range of different audiences in collaboration with all of our different partners. And I guess it's interesting to think about why museums could be a good venue for thinking about public health. Here's just a couple of museums that I like. Constance Classen, as you may know, has talked a lot about this in relation to the museum as a space for thinking about social interaction and moving beyond that space, as Chris Wood says, as simply a space for learning, but also a place to discuss and reflect on life. And I think that's really come out in the talks that you've heard already today. But what we're interested in is, how do we know these sorts of encounters and interactions are good for you? And most importantly, in what ways are they good for you? And I think that relates to our discussion about empathy. So we're very focused on what's the evidence and how can we demonstrate that sort of impact. To do that, we use a whole range of different methods, both quantitative, qualitative, participatory and co-produced methods. And I'll talk very briefly about this because I think it's relevant to really understanding that participant experience and how then we can translate that participant experience into making sure we have the best offers available in those wonderful resources that we're all interested in, like museums and our collections. So we've done a lot of work focused around how we can capture quantitative feedback around psychological health, psychological well-being, thinking of things like issues like isolation and loneliness, general health, quality of life. We've developed our own measure, which I'll talk briefly about, which was a response to the whole range of plethora of existing validative, quantitative and clinical measures that exist for looking at psychological health that have not been developed for looking at the sorts of interactions that we're talking about in relation to creativity and culture. We've done a lot of work around thinking about more participatory methods, so how we can get the participant voice better embedded in reporting those sorts of encounters. And then also thinking about how we can co-produce better methods to record that with healthcare professionals, with participants, their families and their carers. And a large part of that is related to all the sorts of different qualitative approaches that exist. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but again, if people want to ask questions, we can at the end. This is a measure that we developed in specific response to the issues around capturing quantitative feedback in museums and other organisations. And it's based on something called the PANAS, the Positive Effect, Negative Effect Scale, where participants can rate both the positive and negative psychological impacts of engaging in activities. And this has been developed with a whole range of different museums and is in use in a wide range of different sorts of settings. And it gives you this sort of data. So here's a study that we did working with older adults who were had been referred to a series of museums suffering from isolation and loneliness. They weren't typical museum users. And what you can see, if you look at the left-hand bar on the left-hand chart, you can see the pre-session, so how a pool of individuals participating in those museum activities over the course of 10 weeks, at the beginning of that 10 weeks, how that compares in the darker turquoise rectangle to how they compared at the end of that 10 weeks. So what we get there is some statistically significant data showing that those participants significantly improved their psychological well-being thanks to taking part in a 10-week museum programme. So that's great. We can get lots of lovely quantitative data like that and evidence. And we also can think about more specific activities that are going on within the sorts of engagements that we're talking about. So here is a measure that we developed working with healthcare professionals and carers in different settings within hospitals. This is focused on dementia, but we've also worked around stroke survival. And here we can look at specific ways that arts engagement, working with museum objects, craft, art making activities can support specific health outcomes, both psychological and physical. So for example, things like hand-eye coordination, precision grip, attention and agitation. But I guess some of the richest findings, as is often the case, really come from the more qualitative, participatory approaches where we can really capture the participant voice in helping to understand how engagements like museum programmes can impact health and wellbeing. And I won't read through all of these, but we've summarised them here in just some of the key findings that we've found over the last 10 years or so, working with a whole range of different museums and arts organisations. And again, I won't read through all of these, but I think they speak to lots of the things that, for example, Elif has already mentioned, thinking about issues around isolation and connecting with people and that interconnectedness that we know museums can offer. Something that's really important that comes out often is that opportunity to learn and acquire new skills. And that's really important, we know, for cognitive health and sensory connection. Experiences that lead to reduced anxiety and positive emotions. And again, Elif has already mentioned this, things like optimism, hope, and enjoyment. We know that they bring about increased self-esteem and opportunities to make meanings and help connect with a sense of identity. And also that, again, related to interconnection, having those opportunities to have positive conversations and positive distractions, both between ourselves, our families, and, for example, within healthcare settings. And how does all of this work? Well, that's really what we're interested in. Why does it work? And why might we argue that, for example, these sorts of encounters are just as powerful as a clinical intervention? And here, this is why we think it works. And that's that there's several different aspects that play here all at once. These are multisensory experiential engagements that place cognitive engagement. So critical, deep level thinking is at play in these sorts of activities. As we've already heard, people are emotionally connected to the tasks. Usually they're enjoying them, but not always. They have an emotional connection, and that can be challenging in some of those scenarios, but it still links to an emotional connectivity. And there's also a physical element. Now, that might just involve the hands or the hands and eyes, but it may involve the whole body. And at the heart of that, I think, is the element of creativity, where people are working together in spaces or are associated with objects. And we really know that connecting around creativity is massively beneficial. So I just thought I'd end in my last minute or so to highlight just a couple of areas around policy that you might be interested in. In the UK, we've set up a network for professionals, practitioners, and other interested parties who are interested in that interconnection between museums, arts, culture, and health. That's free to join, and there's loads and different resources on there that you're free to access. We've put together this course, which is an introduction to the whole notion of culture and health. And in terms of other resources, if you're interested in this, I'm an advisor to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Arts, Health and Wellbeing, and we produced this report a couple of years ago now, but it includes over 1,000 different references highlighting what we already know about the benefits of arts, cultural, museum engagement. So please have a look at that if you're interested in the evidence base. And here's just some of the other reading that already exists in this area. And you'll see that there's lots of great research that's already been done in this space. So please do go and look at that if you're interested. And just to say finally, thank you once again for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end of our talk.
Yes, and thank you very much for turning us to this vital area of well-being and the therapeutic uses of the museum spaces and art, to which our next speaker, I think, will add her perspective from inside the museum. So, Maral, would you like to begin?
Good afternoon, marhaba, bonjour. Thank you, Tom, and everybody. Great discussion so far. So in preparation for today's session, I actually reflected on the past 3 years of Louvre Abu Dhabi when our museum opened in November of 2017. And I began to question our gauge of empathy as a team of museum educator professionals. And I realized that, and this may be true for many other museum educators and professionals out there, is that in practice and developing and creating opportunities and programs for our public to engage with the museum, we don't often get the chance to pause, to reflect, and to associate with nouns and lenses such as empathy. So we're always in the mode of doing. And it's been quite an eye-opening experience just in preparing, as well as to research what empathy is and to see if we have been aligned in doing so. And of course, echoing what Elif had said and Helen, and through the research, it is in fact the honoring the perspective of the other as their own truth, staying out of judgment, and then recognizing the emotions. So thus empathy does fuel connection, and that is how we're able to make our visitors and our communities feel better when they're engaging with us. And those connections are really important for us at the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And as a young, agile museum of the 21st century, we at Louvre Abu Dhabi are not only, we have the advantage not only to experiment, try and tweak of the programs and what we're doing, but also to learn from research, our colleagues and institutions. And in doing so, we can say that we're actually starting off on the right foot. And when it comes to building our community, there is the underlying understanding of empathy. Even when we don't define it or label it as such, it is very much embedded in our thinking, planning, and programming through connectedness, self-awareness activities, and harnessing the aesthetic response. Of course, the motivation and the drive for our programming is always anchored by the museum's collection and the narrative, but we're also very much centered on the individual and the collective of our community. And here is the academic and the non-academic community as well as working with governmental and non-governmental bodies that support the engagement of the museum with the different parts of our society. So we have a long way to go, but our hearts are in the right place. And I think that's a promising place to start to move forward. And we have more than our work to show for, as we are very much inclusive, locally focused, forward thinking and experimental. So just on that, I wanted to share basically, this was our situation at the Louvre Abu Dhabi not long ago when, you know, the galleries and the museum was flooded with all the students and everybody who was visiting to contemplate and to see and to marvel at the artwork or the building itself. So I want to just highlight very quickly on a few of the groups that we work with very closely in the museum. And I'll start with our focus on the education community engagement building. Of course, from the get-go, we started to work very closely with the Ministry of Education to welcome the schools, the universities, and the teachers. And since our opening till today, we've been able to welcome over 100,000 students physically into the museum, which has been incredible. And our approach is very much driven by storytelling, interpretation, not to discount, of course, the artist's intention or the historical fact of the object, but rather to relate to the viewer through personal interpretation, memory, and creating our own narratives and stories. Further development of the daily visits, we also work on long-term projects. We call them Museum Voices or the Young Guides, where we really invite the students and the schools to study the collection and allow time to research and to come up with their own interpretations of ways that they would like to express their views and the way they see the collection and the artwork through their own ways of interpretation. We were also launching an online platform that engaged a local school with an international school abroad, and we were able to finally kick that off this year due to the confines of COVID. And it's about discussing issues related to them as youth, contemporary issues that they are concerned with in relation to arts and culture. And of course, as a museum, we're always taking the museum outside its walls and going to roadshows, doing outreach, so going into remote areas and talking to people even in different parts of the Emirates. The UAE is quite large. It's a big country. What I also wanted to touch on, which is really important, are the people of determination. Now, I'd like to highlight that in the UAE, the term Oh, sorry.
Excuse me, can I just stop you for a moment? Your PowerPoint isn't moving, I've been informed, and
is it not now?
Have you shared it?
Yes.
Or
share it
perhaps again? Maybe that would be the way to do it, because I think everyone needs to see the slides.
Yes, of course. I have been sharing it. Sorry, give me 1 second.
Perhaps.
Sorry, 1 second.
Here we go.
It is sharing. Okay. If you go full screen.
Okay, there we go.
Okay,
Moving.
Great. Apologies for that. So part of our work is for the people of determination in the UAE. And I'd like to highlight that in the UAE, the term people with special needs or people of disabilities is not commonly used, but rather it's the official term that we use is the people of determination, which was coined back in 2016 by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who introduced the people with special needs as people of determination to recognize their achievements in the various fields in which they worked. So we as the museum, we've been engaging with the various centers and the various individuals from those centers, and as well as the athletes from the Special Olympics. And we have been able to welcome nearly 1,000 individuals since then. A part of what really allows for us to be able to work with people of determination is the fact that the museum is fully accessible and is equipped with various tools to facilitate the visits for the people of determination. And we have a lot of tactile stations that allow for those kinds of interactions as well. And now we're moving into more of a movement and balance online teaching. Out of those collaboration, a few individuals expressed interest in volunteering, which created more opportunities. We also work closely with juvenile care centers and the orphanages in the UAE. Now, the next important part of our community that we work very closely with are the senior Emiratis. Now, I'd just like to take a moment to speak about the nature of how we work here. The GCC, the UAE specifically, is very much anchored on sharing stories and oral history. So a lot of the history that we have is very much oral. And it's really important for us, especially as a cultural institution, to engage with the seniors, to not only welcome them to the museum, but to also have an ongoing exchange and to have those stories shared and documented from our side. So we have been able to welcome on numerous occasions large numbers of the visitors who come from different emirates. So they're far away, they drive for a couple of hours, they show up in buses, and they're able to engage with the different objects inside the museum with our education team. And what we also found after was that the visits, while they were amazing, there were so many rich stories that we wanted to capture, but also have some sort of a connection with the museum object and the younger generation. And we therefore came up with the oral Emirati histories that were connecting an elder who would have an experience, let's say in pearl diving or in jewelry making, which are very much local crafts, and ways of living, to then pass it on to the younger generation. So they would be paired up with a local school, and they would be talking to the students about what happened. And the discussion is revolving around an object from the museum that they're able to discuss later in a seated discussion, as you see in the images. Of course, these connections are very much valued. And while the physical became more difficult with COVID, we were able to continue to connect with our senior Emiratis through the mindful sessions that we continue to carry out with them. And now they have adapted a more of a meditative approach of slow looking and focusing on one object at a time, especially now with lockdown. Not many people over the age of 60 are able to go to public spaces. So we're able to go to them in the event that they're unable to come to us. In the lockdown, we were also challenged by the fact that we needed to go online. So we, in that empathy and staying aware of our community and the needs, we've created several resources and learning opportunities and programs online on the website, where families or teachers or the children could go and interact with the collection, even though they weren't able to visit the museum. So videos such as the Make and Play, social media postings, our family art talk. We did a summer challenge online, and we have the artwork from home, the art from home with visual stories and worksheets that are available, all of which are free. Of course, in June of 2020, in late June 2020, the museum reopened with the core value of a mindful museum, where we're for culture, for community, and for one another. And internally, we thought this was an incredible new lens for us to work with, not only for us to open back up and feel safe and secure, but to also understand that notion of mindfulness. So we have begun with awareness sessions with our staff and training that's ongoing. We're created a webinar where we're discussing it with different professionals. We just launched our first webinar where we're just opening up this discussion of mindfulness and understanding of mindfulness. We also offer kayaking around the museum, which is quite a beautiful therapeutic experience and an exercise that you can try. We're going to start yoga quite soon, and we're offering programs and podcasts on mindfulness and slow looking through recordings and so forth. And of course, we're also very fortunate that we're able to work with some of the hospitals, and we've had a visit from a patient who has been in the hospital since August, and his first visit was to the museum last week. It's his first visit out of the hospital, and it was almost an immediate reaction that we saw on the patient, who was just in awe. And of course, the advantage now, although it's quiet and not usual, but the advantage is that you have the whole museum to yourself almost, so that you have the time to walk around and enjoy the galleries and explore it at your own pace. So we are moving into that direction of more on the medical patient visits, to really work with mindfulness contemplation and continue to work with the different sections of our community, of course. And next is for us to move forward into our therapy, which is more of a specialized field that we require assistance with, and we require more of the expertise to work closely with as a museum, which is definitely where we're headed, along with all the programs that we're running. And of course, the value of evaluating the programs that we're doing in terms of empathy and mindfulness. In the end, we're here to facilitate and make sense of the world we live in by connecting with memories and stories through art so that individuals and visitors can construct their own understanding of self through the objects by looking, discussing, and making, thus creating meaning and connecting with their peers and the world around them. So that's all I have to say for today. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, many, many thanks, Marl. That was a wonderful tour of all the dimensions of the Louvre Abu Dhabi in regard to our concerns today. And for our last speaker, I turn to Professor Singh very happily and invite her to speak about other aspects of social encounter within the museum.
Thank you very much. I am really grateful to be here, to be invited to have the opportunity to be part of this session. And I'm particularly grateful because I come with a very different perspective from the rest of the speakers on this panel, because I don't work in a museum. And so my perspective is from the outside looking at the museum. So I hope what I have to say will be of some use, even though I'm afraid it's going to be rather different in its tone from what we've heard. And obviously it comes from a different place. I'm particularly grateful to be in this panel because being part of this panel prompted me to look at the work of my amazing co-panelists. And I found it really moving to think of the power of empathy at this juncture, because if I think about how I'm living nowadays, I'm spending all of my days at home, tapping on screens of the phone or the computer, looking at an endless succession of things to buy, whether it's groceries or books. And then when the delivery man comes, I stand at the front window and I ask him to leave the package by the door. And I come out only when he has safely gone away. And then I wipe down the package with sanitizer just in case he's left a trace of himself on the package. So look at what the pandemic has done to me, where I see every other person as a possible source of contagion. And I'm suspicious of every stranger's cough, every sneeze, every burst of laughter, every exhalation of their breath. So I'm keeping people at an arm's length, but the commodities that they bring to my doorstep, I'm holding very close to myself. And this situation, when I think about it, actually seems to me to even be a metaphor for museums, which put things in the center and the communities or the people who might have made these things actually fade into the margins. And I know that this happens with many kinds of museums in many places. But for today's talk, I wanted to speak a little bit about this in relation to the place that I come from, which is India. And I want to talk about one category of museum in India, which is the museum devoted to tribal art, to articulate why I think it's an incredibly hard ask to seek to build empathy through museums. So, a few days ago, I heard that a very important anthropological museum that is in the heart of India laid off 20 members of its contract staff. Now, years ago, when I had visited this very museum for the first time, I found its narrative to be entirely predictable. It had an evolutionist storyline where contemporary tribal cultures like this one that we're seeing on the screen were placed at an early stage in the history of the evolution of man. And as I wandered through the gallery, a guard came up to me and he began explaining the wall paintings that I was seeing. And I thought that the museum had been really smart and it must have trained the guards to double up as docents. But in conversation, it turned out that the guard was the artist who had made the paintings. So as a member of the tribe whose culture was on display in the room and a talented artist in his own right, this person, Sher Singh Bhabor, and about 20 other people like him had been hired by the museum on contract as odd job men. And one day they might be cleaning the galleries, another day they might be the watch and ward staff, and a third day they might be asked to come and paint artworks that belong to their tradition on the gallery's walls, All of these tasks being things that they have done as contract workers on minimum wage, working on those conditions for the last 16 years. And as contract staff, their position is not just lowly, but as you well know, it's very precarious. And so they are the ones who are let go during the downturn that the pandemic has visited upon us. Now, this instance of showcasing the culture and dispensing with the people, it seems to me to be emblematic of how India treats its marginalized communities. The people that we call tribal are our indigenous people. They are people who over centuries, if not over millennia, have been forced off the fertile land by wave upon wave of settler. And so they get pushed into the land that nobody else wants, the dense forests, the rocky hills, but only until that formerly unwanted land falls within the zone of a development project, or it turns out to have some mineral resources. And then again, they are brushed aside. And they seem to be people of no account. Sometimes they protest. And sometimes we get to see searing images like this one of a village that was going to be submerged by a dam, whose people refused to move and said that they preferred to drown in situ unless the government gave them proper compensation. And yet, despite the way the actual people from these communities are treated, the difference of our tribal people gets celebrated and their culture gets trotted out at festivals, like this is the Republic Day parade we have every year in India. And it's used to shore up an official narrative of India as an inclusive society. Government funds for diversity initiatives have also given rise to a number of institutions, including a rash of tribal museums that desperately need to be questioned, which have these 19th century style dioramas that show indigenous people as barely dressed primitives who are yet productive members of society, who are embroidering cloth, or who are weaving fishnets, or who are gathering forest produce. And in these displays, nothing ruptures their pre-modern harmony, and the difficulties that they actually face in their present situation never enters these museum displays. Now, despite the reductiveness of our museum system, it has also led to the discovery of some prodigious talents. And perhaps the saddest story belongs to the most remarkable artist who ever emerged out of this matrix, a man called Jangar Singh Shyam, whose photograph you're seeing here. Jangar grew up grazing sheep and working in road construction in a village in central India, when a museum that had sent out teams to find tribal art discovered the paintings that he had made on the village walls. And it's a dizzying story after that, where an influential artist and museum director, whom you're seeing on the right, takes Jangar under his wing, plays mentor, and helps Jangar's amazing talent to flourish. So Jangar is given a job at this museum, where he has access to paper and paint and encouragement, and he produces this stream of eye-catching work which find a local market and which find international attention. He participated in a landmark show at the Centre Pompidou, for instance, but perhaps the most amazing and important commission that he ever got was to make murals in the forecourt of the legislature building of the province in which he lived. So here is the overall shot of the mural, and here is a detail of one of the walls of his murals, which is filled with these leaping tigers and aeroplanes that look like flying fish. But it all came to an end here, in a corner of northern Japan, where a Japanese artist and musician established a museum specifically for India's folk and tribal arts. He built a remarkable collection by inviting incredibly talented artists from India's village communities to come and to be in residence in the museum. And in exchange for about $200 a month, They would make these large works which would enter the museum's collection, and they would also produce these smaller pieces that the museum would sell to defray the costs of the residency. Now, coming from very humble backgrounds with no negotiating powers, perhaps the artists didn't quite realize how much they were giving the museum and how little they were actually getting in return. But Jangar visited the museum several times, and this international connection that he had must have really meant something to him, because he even called his daughter Japani, which means Japanese. But in the summer of 2011, Jangar didn't want to go back to Japan. He'd already turned down an invitation to be an artist in residence, like the artists you see in this slide. He turned down an invitation the previous year, and he thought it would be rude to turn it down again. So with misgivings, he went. And over the 3 months that he stayed at the museum, he became increasingly cold and lonely and anxious. And he was really looking forward to returning home when the museum told him that he hadn't produced enough work and he needed to stay longer. So in a letter that he wrote to his family, he said, "Yesterday they took me to Yokohama to extend my visa. They are saying I can go in 3 weeks, but I do not think that they will let me go. I have no trust in when they will relieve me. I'm very miserable, and now it's in God's hands." This was the last letter he wrote home before he committed suicide. And after that, there was an unseemly wrangle over his dead body, which the museum said it couldn't afford to return to India. And it said if the family would just let them cremate Jangar in Japan, it'll be so much cheaper to just ship the ashes home, and that the museum would actually give the family a little cash in compensation from what they saved. The Mithila Museum continues to commission art and to sponsor events by Indian artists. It even continues to hold and exhibit Jangar's work. For its audiences, it is opening a window to another world. And elsewhere, Jangar's death has turned him into the Vincent van Gogh of Indian tribal art. The prices of his work have skyrocketed. Collectors have sold Jangar's work. Museums have bought them. His death has made him more individual, more interesting, more unique. It has added value to him. And as these museums all share Jangar's work and they enrich the experience of their audiences and they help them to have a fellow feeling for people who are distant from themselves, one has to really ask, what is the work of empathy that has been done through exhibiting these works? To what end and for whom? Or would we have to actually think harder about a system that is geared up to preserve artworks, but which consumes the artist instead?
Oh, well, many, many thanks, Kavita, for that really trenchant and moving and absolutely apposite contribution to this topic. And a wonderful way, I mean, sadly compelling transition to the kinds of discussion I hope we'll now have among our participants. And I simply ask people to jump in, begin speaking. I don't want to have to, police the discussion in any way. So who would like to begin with a question to one of your fellow panelists or an observation raised by something they've said? Well, shall I? And I would like to come back to your contribution, Kavita. When you were thinking about empathy as a topic and the more uplifting kind of aspirations that have dominated our discussion, did that motivate you to bring this story in and say, best intentions, especially if they are captured by more acquisitive and self-interested parties? Is that an obstacle to the goals that our other panelists have expressed?
Of course, I mean, of course, you can have the perversion of every good intention. And so while I'm a great devotee of museums and I love visiting them and I have a great faith in what they can do, but I also understand the possibility of all sorts of entrenchments in the museum going wrong. And here really, though I've been saying museums, it's actually about the other M word, which is the market, right? Mm-hmm. So what really did swallow up Jangad, I think, is the market and the museum's terrible conflation or, interpellation with the market, which produced a range of forces. But what also made it possible for it to turn so absolutely tragic was the radical alterity of the person, right? So the world of the museum, the world that the museum is creating, those who are creating the museum, their world is so very different from his world. And perhaps what happens is that the faith in the universalist possibilities of art, that when I see your creativity, I recognize something of myself in you, the faith in that actually elides the differences that you are actually structurally unable to bridge in that situation. And so perhaps that is something that we need to look at,
Yes, and I wonder if others of you involved in this broad project have encountered at least cognate situations where there was some unbridgeable gap.
Well, if I could just say, one of the presentations that I saw in a conference once, which just blew my mind, it was like fireworks going off in my head, was a slide that showed a museum in Paris, which used to be, I'm forgetting which one it used to be, the Trocadero, which has now become the Museum of Migration, right? And that museum was actually occupied by sans-papiers. Right. So when there was a big push to identify people, illegal immigrants, and to try and identify and deport them, they actually occupied that museum. And it seemed to me like the most incredibly sharp exposure of ironies, that you can make a museum supposedly celebrating a phenomenon which has enriched your society, and you say, yes, we understand that historically migrations have done this, we understand what cosmopolitanism means, but at the same time, the very people who are the material of that connection are the ones whom the immigration police is looking for, right? So what's happening on the policing wing of things is very different from what's happening on the cultural, rhetorical platforms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, and everyone is, of course, involved in broader constituencies around the museum, using it or potentially using it, that have, by virtue of migration, have become more and more diverse and, in some ways, factionalized. And I think that dimension is implicit, really, in what a number of you have been addressing. So I would love to hear a little more about that from one or another of you.
Yeah, please. Because all of you actually spoke about addressing certain kinds of constituencies through your empathy work.
Yes, and urban audiences in the UK, Helen, is that?
Yeah, I mean, this is coming up a lot in the UK. I'd be interested to hear from the other speakers around the core function of museums and other kind of arts, cultural assets, and indeed, other resources in the community, whether it's a library or a green space. And I guess the pandemic has really highlighted around inequalities, and those people who are not able, for various reasons, and are not accessing our wonderful museums and spaces, and how do we make that transition? And a lot of the museums that we work with, the way that they have done it is through having a complete shift really in their core purpose, rethinking their entire strategic mission, changing, some of the work that Maral talked about, changing job descriptions, people, the types of people who are delivering those roles. And there's some great examples in the UK and I know elsewhere of museums completely shifting their entire focus about how they use their space, how they attract audiences and the staff that they have in those spaces, that have a focus specifically on issues, say, around inequalities and issues around wellbeing. And I think that will become more and more apparent as the pandemic becomes realised on the impacts on the arts and cultural sector, certainly is in the UK. Where I think there's going to be big shifts. And we're seeing, for example, great initiatives, say, with Arts Council working with NHS, focused around how topics like social prescribing and community health can be linked better, specifically to tackle marginalised audiences, specifically to tackle health inequalities. And I think rather than it being seen as a kind of nice and extra work, an additional programme or additional activity or an additional audience that you might work with, instead that it would become refocused as a core purpose of that organisation. I guess that's many of our dreams. That is what they are as institutions. I think their core purpose should be.
Well, thank you very much for that extension of Kavita's really very strong moral considerations that enter into how museums are now reconceiving the engagement with the audience beyond simply putting the art on display in its best appearance with the best information, which used to be considered entirely sufficient. Now, Elif, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, I know that you started your project before the pandemic, obviously, as it's very far along and well developed. And how specifically have the conditions of the pandemic and the probable next couple of years of relatively restricted access and to museum collections and spaces, how have you been thinking about that?
Well, thank you. And also, I would like to share a resource regarding Kavita's discussion. There's a group in the US, they have started this movement called Empathetic Museums. So Empathetic Museums is only focusing on the institutional empathy of museums, from their hiring practices to job descriptions, as Helen mentioned, and who gets to be represented, whose voice is heard, and to create diverse, inclusive, and equitable working places. And this is a part of a larger effort of decolonizing museums, right? It's a mindset, and museums are just a tool if they reflect our worldview. However, a tool that we might have, it depends on our worldview, how we use it. So going back to Tom's question, I think museums will have to rethink about their vision and mission and how they'll become more and more relevant to the society. I think definitely one of the outcomes will be that they will become more of a places of healing and emotional well-being, because this pandemic just took such a tremendous toll on all of us that we are seeking to be in the company of others in safe places. We would like to have a dialogue with another, in the same room, and even a feeling of touching, and our sensory experiences are so limited that are really affecting our ability to perceive our connectedness. And so I think this really poses a important challenge, but also an opportunity for museums. Because usually the best description of a transformative empathic experience is through creating some sort of a vulnerability in the person. But if it is done in a museum setting, this is done in a safe space. So you're not really in a real life situation. But what happens through this experience of vulnerability is that we tend to sort of reprioritize what is essential in life. And what is essential is coming out in these discussions, like our morals, our values. What are our expectations from being a human being? We have this one life or many lives in other traditions, but what is it? How are we going to use this opportunity that we have? And it only depends, museums are just a tool, and they are readily available platforms for us to rethink what we want, what kind of interactions human beings should have with one another and our environment. And then perhaps, we can also, as we innovate in museums, we can also try to create other spaces, new spaces that just focus on this of, well-being, connectedness, and finding our meaning and purpose in our existence.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. And as I need to turn to the questions from our attendees at this point, with only about 10 minutes left. And the question I just asked you was very similar to one asked by Maria Veronica Leon Ventimilla, who also congratulates all the speakers on their brilliant talks. There was a question for, let me see, forgive me as I navigate. There was, from an anonymous attendee, there was a question for Helen. In the studies, do you see any difference in the feelings generated by a museum visit depending on the type of museum? Old master paintings versus contemporary photography, for example, or the profile of the visitors, young versus older people. Do young people also feel happier after a visit?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I was just typing my answer, and most of the evidence seems to suggest actually it doesn't really matter what the type of collection is or the object is. It's more related to the specific tasks associated with what's going on in those activities. So, for example, how are people engaging with the objects or the collections? And critically, the number one thing is who is facilitating those. So having really experienced practitioners who can understand both the people, the participants involved in those activities and what their needs are, and then how to co-create sessions that bring about the most optimal outcomes. And that really seems to be the number one most important aspect of it. So having people who have the knowledge of the collections is really, really great. But unless they understand where the participants are coming from, what the participants' knowledge base, interests and expertise are, then it's very difficult to co-create and co-produce programs and activities that bring about benefits for everybody. So not everybody in a group, no matter where you're coming from or what your background is going to want to sit and listen to, say, for an hour lecture from an expert on a particular type of object or a particular collection. However, what we know is if participants are involved in co-producing and co-creating activities, as Maral has talked about, we know that we see much, much better outcomes, and we can even prove that statistically. So I think having those experts alongside people and or expertise who have an understanding of participants and how to bring and work together with participants is actually, I think, the most important thing. And we've seen, museums with very, very different collections bringing about those very similar sorts of outcomes simply on the basis of that really engaged facilitation and that bringing in that co-production and co-creation. And the other aspect of that is the number one thing that comes out is when those activities and tasks are multisensory. So when people are bringing in aspects of critical thinking, deep cognitive processing, so they're engaged in discussion, both audio and visual, and they're doing physical tasks. So it might be handling objects, it might be drawing, it might be craft activities. So the multisensory aspect seems to be really important.
Yes, which one of our questioners, Francesca Bacci, asked specifically about the dependence of empathy on sharing a physical space. That is, the empathy with the body of another depends on, the way in which our bodies take up space and interact, in a visible, three-dimensional environment. Is there still a way to have a multisensory cultural experience in a virtual museum space? Maral, as you're right in the heart of the museum, you should, I'm certain you have spent a lot of time thinking about this. Do you have any further thoughts?
Yes, I think for us, as I said, in terms of the physical visits, though limited nowadays, the next chapter for us is definitely relying on the digital and what is innovative in terms of how the museum is making itself more accessible online. Still, the interaction inside physically, there's nothing that defeats that experience. There's nothing like it. However, we see, and even from the panelists in yesterday's presentations, we can see that how more and more, although we're challenged by this question and this task, we are actually able to think more creatively. Going back to when the lockdown happened, March we closed, and by late March, early April, we had to really think on our feet to come up with how can we just keep engaging and keep people engaging with us. So we were all producers, directors, filmmakers, voiceover talents, and actors out overnight to create that content. But of course, that's the initial reaction. It's very reactive. And then, as I said, you need to have a moment to take back. And this is what the pandemic allowed for a moment for just to stop and really think. So for us, our approaches is really to work across institutions, to work with our peers, with our other teams as well, to continue to offer more solutions on innovation. Just a couple of days ago, on the anniversary of the museum, we released The Pulse of Time, which is an incredible film that's been in the making for a while as an audio track, but we then realized there's a video component that's needed for it. It's available on our YouTube channel as well. And it's an incredible film that tells the story of the collection, but narrated by some beautiful voices. And I just will invite everybody to go check out The Pulse of Time. So these are the kinds of things that we're going into more elaborate ways of really heightening the collection and getting people to see it from a different angle and not just a one-way view. So of course, the 360 virtual tours were everywhere. Everybody was doing virtual tours, but what else can you do to look at the collection, to engage with the museum? So for students and children, we're doing that on a daily basis. We have everything that's happening for the adults. There are still individuals coming to the museum, and everything is now app-based or QR code-based, and everything in terms of activities. We have a series of kids apps that are being launched, and things you can do as a family. If you show up, you can just scan with your phone, and you can have an engagement even though you're inside the museum and we're unable to provide paper-based activities. So everything is being provided now, but I think we're moving even faster in terms of technology and advancement, and we need to catch up. So the work is, although it seems we're people say, why are you working from home 12 hours a day? And we say, actually, it's now doubled because we have to keep up ahead of the current. Whereas before it was very clear, you come in, if people come in, you close and you go home. Now it's actually no. The work, although working from home, it hasn't gotten easier, but it's definitely interesting and challenging to the mind and our creativity.
Yeah, well, similar things have happened to teaching as a result of these conditions, I can testify to. Maybe you'd like to just stay with us. There was more of an observation from Pia Shobha Shamzani. Says, I can think of the Holocaust Museum as a fine example of evoking empathy in other museums and monuments of victims of wars and massacres. Here in the UAE, we have the Martyrs Monument in Abu Dhabi, designed by Idris Khan. This deepens the understanding of both Emirati and international visitors of shared loss and empathy.
Yes, so as the Louvre Abu Dhabi being one of the museums that opened 3 years ago, but of course there is all the public art, there are other art spaces that exist like Warehouse 41, plus there is the prospect of future museums that will open, such as the Zayed National Museum and the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi that will open up in the next 3 to 5 years. So going into monuments or going into more observing public art, that's also available. So most of the parks and the public spaces are now open with the precautions of social distancing and all the safety measures that we have to abide by. But definitely it's something for the audiences to go and to see. So art is not only limited to you coming to the museum and see it. Art is really everywhere that when you're interacting with your city. And what we've observed, we don't just keep it to coming in. I mean, we're surrounded by this beautiful body of water and a beautiful green space that we have. Hopefully you'll come to Abu Dhabi and visit us and see. It's incredible. So even for you to enjoy the outdoor space, as I said, there is the kayaking aspect, there is you walking. Everybody's nowadays walking and exercising. So there is also that ability for the public space outside of the galleries for the public to enjoy and use and reflect, whether it's nature, whether it's a full moon, or however you're doing photography, running, walking, and all these great physical activities that have been that have come up. So whether it's an introspective reflection on an artwork to feel something, or whether it's the Holocaust Museum or more of the Martyrs Museum, if that's the kind of experience you're seeking, or if you're looking to just release energy and go and be active, that's also available. And this is why museums such as public spaces are really important, because these are the different avenues and the different opportunities that we provide.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There was just one very, there are some really very nice questions that have emerged. One that I might take myself is from Laura Pressac, who asked whether empathy was universal, or was it contingent on changes from place to place and from historical period to historical period. That is a profound and vast question, which we certainly have run out of time properly to address. But I would say that, universality is never achieved, but I think it is a goal, that it is implied in all of your ideas of empathy, that there would be more and more common ground, more and more shared understanding, but not presumed, or dictated as a common universal human condition, perhaps reached at the end of some evolution, as Kavita was talking about. To dwell on particularity to the exclusion of how, our various spheres, like in a Venn diagram, overlap one another, and maybe that overlapping can be enlarged as far as possible, seems to be a reasonable but very aspirational goal, from what I'm hearing from all of you, from even more outside than Kavita is, and that I have not participated in this sphere before, but I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to be part of it. And I think we have reached the end of our time.